I told you I'd be bringing a few friends.
You should have brought more.
Welcome to Resident Evil Month, and what better way to kick off Resident Evil Month than going back to where it all began, with the NES classic Sweet Home developed by Capcom. This game is not only an absolute masterpiece and a game that was way ahead of its time, but it is the game that led to the creation of the franchise we know and love, Resident Evil. Before Alone in the Dark, before Resident Evil, and before Silent Hill, there was Sweet Home. The first game of its kind. Though classified as a RPG, it is without question the first survival horror game of its kind, and it is no wonder that it set the landmark for survival horror the way that it has. The mechanics, the story, all of it is absolutely perfect. And the really interesting irony behind all of it is not only was it ahead of its time in terms of gameplay, but it was a game not only that was based on a movie of the same name, Sweet Home, but in many ways it is considered to be more superior than the movie that it is based on. Sweet Home is not only a perfect example of an amazing horror game unlike any other, but that there is an exception to movie licensed video. If you are a Resident Evil fan or just a fan of survival horror in general, you owe it to yourself to play this game. Not only to pay respects to the great granddaddy of survival horror, but to also just go back to the roots of Resident Evil and survival horror and where it all began. because it is such an interesting experience, to say the least. And playing this game, you will definitely never be able to shake that feeling of playing Resident Evil. Though this is not technically a Resident Evil game, if you are a fan of the franchise, you will definitely be able to feel it deep down inside. Because this, to me, is a part of the Resident Evil franchise and should always remain a part of the Resident Evil franchise. This, to me, should be the true Resident Evil 0. However, though, with that being said, what makes this game so interesting compared to the ones that we are used to today, Silent Hill and Resident Evil? Well, let's get started, because this is one I've wanted to talk about for a long time. Now, if you've played the original Final Fantasy or the original Dragon Quest, then this game will feel very familiar to you, as it does play out like a lot of games of its kind back then, as it is still a classic RPG of the 80s, but with many mechanics that were way ahead of its time, such as the limited inventory system, the puzzles, and the ability to be able to split up and stick together through the team-up system and the use of the game's call mechanic, where in battle, should you face an enemy that is too tough, you can call your other party, come together as one party, and team up against the threat, which is a very unique mechanic that so few RPGs, even today, even bother to utilize anymore. And, of course, the biggest innovation of the time was the game's permadeath mechanic, which it may not have been the first game to ever utilize this mechanic as far to my knowledge, but it was something we hadn't quite seen very much back in the day, and it adds to this constant sense of dread and helplessness, as anyone can die at any moment, and should your party member die, you will not get them back. It adds a sense of humanity and realism to video games that had never been seen before at the time. And it is just absolutely brilliant. To be able to create a game like this, even within the limitations of the NES, is beyond impressive. And it really shows how ahead of its time this game is. Now, you might look at this game now and think it's nothing special, it just looks like another Dragon Quest, and you would be wrong. The game mechanics are impressive and ahead of their time. The story is really great, dark, with tons of twists and turns. It's dripping with atmosphere, and it's not slow-paced and clunky like the other RPGs before it. It is very fast-paced and never spins its wheels. Unlike games like Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy, where the games revolved around a system of grinding to pad out the gameplay, there is no such thing in this game. While you do gain experience, you almost never need to stop to grind. The game is always moving. You are never slowed down, you never have to stop and grind for hours just to continue on to a certain part of the game. The only thing that may slow you down is a puzzle or having to discover a secret, but even then, the game generously leaves hints as the main part of the story is figuring out the mystery to what happened here at this mansion, as well as escaping it. So it is extremely addicting to play. It never slows down, and it is never dull and or boring. And it's just such a fun game to play. Once you turn it on, you will never be able to turn it off. And much like Legend of Zelda, it utilized the infamous battery backup, so you can save anywhere at any given time. Once again, just showing just how ahead of its time this game was. It is a marvelous masterpiece. It is beyond an impressive piece of work.
The survival horror genre was popularized in the West after Capcom's release of Resident Evil. The first entry in the Resident Evil series was directed by Tokuro Fujiwara, a developer who had been part of the games industry for a while before he developed the first entry in this recognized horror franchise. Fujiwara took a bulk of his inspiration from a Famicom title that used many mechanics now considered to be core elements of the survival horror genre. That game is Sweet Home. Released in 1989, Sweet Home was an RPG based on a Japanese horror film of the same name. Tokuro Fujiwara took on the role of the game's director, but was supervised by the director of the original movie, Kiyoshi Kurosawa. The game's story is essentially the same as the original film, following a film crew as they explore the abandoned home of the presumed dead painter Mamiya Ichiro. Ichiro was known to have hid several paintings within the mansion before he mysteriously disappeared 30 years ago. The documentary team of 5 attempt to seek out and recover these lost works from the crumbling mansion. Upon entering the mansion, the team are trapped inside by a ghost who threatens to kill them for trespassing. Now left with no other options, the crew must split up and work out a means of escape, all the while facing monsters and navigating the building's crumbling structure. The team discover the ghost's identity to be Lady Mamiya, the late wife of painter Ichiro. It's revealed that 30 years ago, their 2-year-old child had fallen into the house's incinerator and was burnt alive. In order to provide her dead son with playmates, she kills other children so that they may be with him in the afterlife. Only a short time later, she committed suicide and, with her ghost unable to forgive her, became trapped within the mansion. Movement and battles play out similar to most turn-based RPGs, but there are some differences that give the game a more survival horror feel. During fights, the team is able to attack to deal physical damage with their equipped weapon. They can also pray to power up attacks, and call teammates to join the fight and lend assistance. Items can also be utilized for various effects, and each unit is able to run. Each party member is considered an individual, and thus running during fights requires all members to escape. The option of running is dangerous, as it can result in the abandonment of a crew member, leaving them to deal with an enemy solo. Each of the 5 characters have a role within the group. Cameraman Taguchi is capable of revealing hidden images. Art restoration expert Asuka can use her vacuum to clear broken glass. The kind-hearted Akiko is able to heal her companions. Kazuo can make use of his lighter to burn away obstacles, while his daughter Emi is the master of unlocking. By talking with teammates, the player is able to recruit and form stronger groups, which makes both progression and dealing with enemy battles easier. Traveling alone is an incredibly dangerous option, and will likely result in death. By using their tools throughout the mansion as a unit, the team must solve puzzles, defeat monsters, and attempt to get out alive. They're assisted by items spread throughout the mansion, which can be picked up and swapped amongst the party. These items don't just include objects that can be used to solve puzzles and overcome obstacles, but also weapons and armor which can improve character stats. These items can be swapped with other items anywhere in the mansion, and they will remain there until picked up again later. This is an important element to solving puzzles, as limited inventory space and how the player manages it comes into play. In order to solve some puzzles, the team must backtrack, assisted through the mansion's array of alternate doors that can be unlocked. Quick-time events can occur too, requiring the player to make snap decisions under the stress of permadeath. Party members may be killed at any moment as the result of traps and dangerous obstacles, with no means of revival. The unique skills of each character can still be utilized, however, as items that pertain to their talents can be found near their corpses. Depending on the outcome of the team and which members of the crew survive, it's possible to see one of 5 different endings. Sweet Home was one of the first home console games that Tokuro Fujiwara had worked on. When speaking with Kiyoshi Kurosawa about the video game adaptation of his movie, he told not to worry if the game didn't follow the movie exactly. Fujiwara stated that he was able to use the film as a reference, and that with both the film and studio set at his disposal, he was able to use whatever elements he felt would work within the game. He was considerate of how to go about adapting the film into a game, adding extra elements to the story through diary entries from 50 years prior to the events of the game. Sweet Home's successor, Resident Evil, was originally conceived as a remake of this 8-bit title. Fujiwara initially invited Resident Evil's director, Shinji Mikami, onto the team with this goal in mind. Fujiwara believed that Mikami had a good understanding of what is frightening. Later recounting, Mikami hated it. This is how our conversation went. "You hate being scared?" "Yep." So I figured we should do it. If he'd answered that he never got scared, I couldn't have trusted him with the project. People who aren't afraid of anything don't understand what's frightening. In my view, you can't make a horror game if you don't have any fear. Fujiwara was frustrated with his work on Sweet Home, mainly with the original Nintendo's graphical fidelity. When talking about Resident Evil's roots, Fujiwara stated, "Once the PlayStation was released, conversation turned towards the idea of launching an original franchise. The basic premise was that I'd be able to do the things that I wasn't able to include in Sweet Home. It was mainly on the graphics front that my frustration had been building up. I was also confident that horror games could become a genre in themselves. The game's region-locked status is often cited online as being due to the high levels of gruesome imagery and strong adult themes, with Nintendo wanting to keep the family-friendly appearance of the NES. However, no official source ever stated this. It's quite likely that another reason for the game never leaving Japan was due to the game essentially being a movie tie-in. Not only due to the potential licensing issues, but because the movie version of Sweet Home is possibly even more obscure than the game. At the time of release, it's unlikely that an international publication for Sweet Home was ever considered. The game received a full English translation in the year 2000 by Gaijin Productions and Suicidal Translations. This translation is of a high quality and makes the game fully playable in English.
Sweet Home is a masterpiece that you should play at least once. And if you're a hardcore video game collector, or Resident Evil fan, or even a survival horror fan, you owe it to yourself to add this game to your collection. I personally bought myself a reproduction cart, and it was worth every penny, and it sits in my NES collection. Now, the only thing that I can say does suck about Sweet Home, we never got a sequel or remake. It would be really cool if Capcom continued on with the franchise, although I guess you could make the argument that Sweet Home lives on in Resident Evil, the franchise we all know and love so much, and I'm definitely fine with that. While I would like to see another Sweet Home game, Resident Evil is just as good, and I absolutely adore the franchise. So, with that being, thanks for joining me in this blast from the past, and I hope you enjoyed taking this trip down memory lane and going back to the roots of the franchise we all know and love. I really wanted to kick off Resident Evil month with going back to where it all began. And thanks for joining me for the opening and beginning of Resident Evil month. I'll see you next time, where we will get to discuss more Resident Evil, and we will talk a lot more about the franchise we all love. So I'll see you guys around.